So you just passed your exam, or you're considering becoming a licensed radio amateur and you want to buy a radio. Congratulations! Here are some mistakes to avoid and valuable advice I learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Shack. I am Ria, call sign N2RJ. I'm a ham radio operator and I enjoy this hobby a lot, and I'll be sharing everything you need to know about ham radio. So if you don't want to miss a video, hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. This way you'll always get notifications of my newest videos when they're released. So first, a bit of channel news. We are considering doing a live stream show, possibly every couple of weeks. It'll be a collaboration with one or two other content creators, and we'll have something pretty unique for you. So stay tuned, this will be coming out pretty soon. Alright, on to today's topic. New radios for new hams. First, let me explain what my first radios were and why they were interesting. The very first radio I had, like many, was a 2-meter handheld radio. It was a Kenwood TH215A 2-meter handheld. It was a 7-watt handheld radio. Yes, those did exist back then, and it was a pretty big brick. But it had a digital display, keypad and DTMF or touch tones, memories and other stuff. I had bought it from a local ham in Trinidad and Tobago for about 500 TT dollars, or about 80 US dollars. It was used and it had a few issues. This old radio also did not have a good battery. I ended up buying a few cordless phone batteries and rebuilding the battery pack, but the bigger problem is that where I lived, the repeaters really weren't accessible with handheld radios. Actually, that's not really correct. You see, in Trinidad we had 2 repeaters operated by the local radio club. Tobago later added another repeater. Most locals used a repeater close to the capital city, Port of Spain, which was far from where I lived in the southern part of the island. The repeater I could access from home easily didn't have a lot of people talking on it, so a handheld radio absolutely was not going to cut it. Eventually, to be able to use this radio, I had 2 iterations of antennas. One of them was a Slim Jim, which is an end-fed half-wave antenna with a quarter-wave J-style match. It has a better bandwidth and gain than another popular antenna, the J-pole, and has a lower takeoff angle. However, it needs to be isolated from the mast, unlike a J-pole. Most people made them using a piece of pipe and put the antenna element inside of it. It was great for VHF simplex, and a lot of operators in Trinidad and Tobago used it. The J-pole didn't catch on as much back in the 1990s when I got licensed. The Slim Jim, however, allowed longer distance communications than using a J-pole. The other antenna I made was a 3-element beam, which I found in the ARRL handbook. I actually cut up an old stainless steel CB antenna and used that to make the elements. It worked pretty great. The end result was that I was able to use my 7-watt handheld radio to talk on a local repeater, take part in local nets, and connect with local hams on simplex. HF was fully out of reach for me as we didn't have a lot of money, and the exchange rate meant that most hams there could only buy used old radios. Anyway, I did eventually get an HF transceiver, sort of. My Elmer Tony 9Y4AL gave me a kit for a 20-meter CW transceiver. It was supplied by the IARU to developing countries, and it was a rather simple design and included twin lead to make a simple 20-meter antenna. I had fun with that rig and made many contacts on 20-meter Morse code. But I was part of a dying breed of hams who learned Morse code to get licensed and had an interest in Morse code. But it was still loads of fun. I got my first taste of a commercial HF transceiver from my friend Noel. Back then he was 9Y4NED. Today he is 9Y4X. Noel had a Kenwood TS440S with the automatic tuner, and he carried a G5RV antenna so he could throw that up anywhere and make contacts. Noel had a pretty nice station, including then modern radios, computer, and even satellite capability. Noel eventually went on to become treasurer for the IARU in Region 2, which is basically the Americas. I actually did buy that rig at a Hamfest back in 2005 for $250 and I still have it. It's an absolute tank and I'm holding on to it basically forever. So these are my first radios. Clearly I learned a few things. Now I want to tell you some mistakes that hams make when they get licensed and buy new radios, because there are parts of the story I haven't told you. So let's get to the list. The first kind of radio that many new hams buy and then get frustrated with, the kit radio that you have to know Morse code to use. Yeah, we've seen them, the little pixie radios you buy off eBay or for a few bucks from China. I've actually seen a few hams get them and then get frustrated with them. There are other radios that are sold by various groups that specialize in low power or QRP operation. But for a beginner, these will be frustration city. There are two reasons why. One, you have to know Morse code to use them. And two, they're just really low power radios with basic receivers. The Pixies in particular are a nice novelty and good to learn soldering skills, but for a beginner's first radio, I would pass. If you really want to use this kind of radio, I would really suggest learning Morse code with a course from Long Island CW Club or CW Op CW Academy. This way, you can learn Morse code. Secondly, I would recommend going on Facebook or groups.io and looking for groups that have schedule contacts or SKEDs for Morse code contacts. I would also suggest a healthy dose of patience with these radios. And finally, get a good antenna. There are tools that allow you to see how you're getting out and where your signal's reaching, which can help you test your antennas. One of them is the Reverse Beacon Network, or RBN. Throw out some CQs in Morse code, then go to www.reversebeacon.net, and then you can look for your call sign if you want to see how you're getting out. People may reply to you, which is great, but that's not the point of this really. The point is to see how the receivers are hearing you. On this low power theme, the next kind of radio that new hams may buy is the full-fledged commercially built QRP or low power HF radio. This would be like the Elecraft KX3, KX2, Yaesu FT817 or 818, Zygo G90 or the ICOM 705. What's worse is that many hams will pair this with a very compromised antenna like these short whip antennas with loading coils. The same problem applies. You have a low power with a short antenna and you'll have a tough time getting out. But unlike the Pixie and the kit radios, at least with these radios, they have decent receivers and they have SSB voice and digital mode capability in some, so there's less chance of being frustrated. My advice, if you're buying one of these radios, pair it with a good antenna, like a roll-up dipole or end-fed, and consider getting a 100-watt amplifier to go with it. Yes, QRP can build skill, but you need to start making contacts first and then perhaps going the more difficult route. I don't like to see new hams starting out then getting frustrated. Having the tools to make contacts will help you get encouraged. In the case of the 705, I would recommend running it with a 13.8 volt power supply rather than the HT battery clipped on the back of it, so you're getting the full 10 watts out. This can be a lithium iron phosphate battery or even an AC brick like my PAE KX33 power supply. And as always, exercise a healthy dose of patience whenever you operate. If you're having trouble, find a local Elmer or maybe look online to get some advice. So let's shift gears. The next kind of radio that some new hams buy is the most expensive radio or highest performance radio they can find. The price of the radio in and of itself is not a problem, but there is a tendency to get gas when you get your ham radio license. What is gas? Well, in the YouTube world, we have a term called gear acquisition syndrome, where you just keep buying lots of gear without a plan, without need for it. The reality is that gear doesn't make you a good operator. It helps build on what you have in terms of skills and knowledge, but it can't make you a good operator. The other thing is that the highest price radios are usually aimed at contesters, people who operate ham radio competitively, and the primary factor when buying a radio for them is performance in a crowded band, specifically the ability to pull out weak signals among strong ones. This may not be necessary for you if all you want to do is have a conversation with friends on air, or maybe check into nets, casually chase DX, operate digital modes, or do emergency communications. In fact, if you really do want to spend money, I would recommend putting the most money into your antenna system and then buying a radio with what's left over. A good rig is only as good as the antenna it's connected to, and a poor antenna connected to a high dollar rig is not going to give great results. In fact, it may be downright disappointing. A great antenna connected to a so-so rig will still give great results. While we're on the topic, let's talk about amplifiers. First, let me say that I love amplifiers. I love operating with high power. I love owning the band. But I think that for a beginner ham, rushing and buying an amplifier with their first station is a mistake. 100 watts is plenty to work with. The bigger picture with this is that once you cross the 100 watt or even 500 watt barrier, it really begins to test your station. You'll find that antennas and connections that work absolutely fine with 100 watts will fail, sometimes catastrophically at 500 watts or higher. At legal limit, it could result in fires and serious damage to station components. If you have nearby neighbors, you could be getting into their electronics and other stuff. Then you also have to consider RF exposure. Is 1500 watts safe for you or your neighbors? Don't let me discourage you, but think carefully about what you're getting yourself into. Like I said, nothing is wrong with high power, but it does require careful planning and consideration. The other problem with using an amplifier is that if you don't have antennas to allow you to receive well, you'll become what we affectionately call an alligator. You can guess where I'm going with this. All mouth and no ears. You'll be loud as the day is long, but you can't hear anyone. So it all becomes just a giant waste of time. So this is where I go back and say, work on your antennas first, then worry about a rig, then worry about an amplifier. It'll pay dividends to look at your station this way. The next kind of radio I would avoid as a newcomer is an old tube type radio or hybrid radio, which has solid state components and tube finals. This would be like the Yaesu FT101, not the FTDX101, which is a new software defined radio, the Kenwood TS520, the Yaesu 901 or 902, Kenwood TS820S, etc. These radios are nice and nostalgic, but a bit tricky to tune for transmit. And you're buying them used, and one in good condition goes for around $400 US, which could be spent on something a bit more modern. Add to that the risk of high voltage if you attempt to repair it yourself. Fully tube type radios, I would strongly advise against it. A lot of these are expensive anyway because collectors buy them, and the same caveat applies. They can be risky with high voltages and also have unknown condition of buying used. If you do have someone who can teach you how to use that style of radio, that may work. Otherwise, look for something newer and solid state. So far, we've been HF centric. Let's talk about VHF and above. But first, let's pass the borderline 10 meters. When I was first licensed, I showed my Elmer the Radio Shack catalog and mentioned the HTX 100 transceiver, which is their 10-meter rig. Now, I actually bought one of those later on. However, buying it as a new licensee would have been a mistake. To begin with, 10 meters really only shines when you have propagation at the peak of the solar cycle. You can talk to foreign countries, aka work DX, on 10 meters with relative ease at the solar peak. Beyond that, though, it becomes very tough and you'll be listening to a lot of dead air on 10 meters. It's almost a tragedy that the lowest class of license in the US only allows voice privileges on 10. Maybe that will be changed in the future, who knows. But you can upgrade to general and get access to the rest. However, with the 10-meter radio, you're basically stuck on 10 meters. It's going to get you frustrated really quickly. The money would probably be better spent on a good used HF radio. By the way, you may see a lot of 10 and 12 meter radios. These are labeled as ham radios, but are really intended to operate on 11 meters. Personally, I don't care if you operate on 11. It's between you and the FCC or your national regulator. However, these radios aren't going to make good ham radios for the same reason that the Radio Shack 10-meter rig didn't make a good starter ham radio. So next, let's talk about VHF and UHF radios. Today, the big buzz is about DMR and other similar digital modes. A company called RF Finder actually sells an Android phone which has a DMR radio built in. On Facebook, I actually saw a prospective ham who said that they bought an RF Finder Android radio as their first radio to listen. That to me was just wild. Why? First of all, let's go back to where I said that you shouldn't just go and buy the most expensive radio out there. And for ham radio focused DMR radios, this is pretty much one of the most expensive radios out there. Don't get me wrong, it's a good radio and a good concept, but an unlicensed person buying an expensive radio like that to just listen is nuts. For listening, you're better off buying a scanner or a more expensive DMR radio anyway. However, if you know what you're doing and you want to eventually get into DMR and use that kind of radio, then yes, it would be a sound purchase. There is a concept of buyer's remorse, and you may not even like DMR, so that's why I say start off with something cheap you can learn with, and then when you're ready, get the expensive radio. Speaking of digital, unless you want the radio for its analog features, I would not go picking a standard among digital radios unless you know for sure what's in your local area. Digital VHF UHF ham radio these days has at least 4 competing standards. D-Star, which is primarily an ICOM and Kenwood thing, Yaesu System Fusion or YSF, DMR, which is a commercial standard developed mostly by Motorola, and P25, which is a public safety standard, which also sits in the Motorola realm. Digital is actually pretty nice. You can talk far and wide instead of being stuck with a dead repeater in town. However, if you don't know what's in your area, then you're going to be stuck with a radio that you'll use in analog mode 99% of the time, or you'll have to use a hotspot. Hey, if that's your goal, more power to you. But a lot of hams, I think, are missing out by using only hotspots. The last and final one is about Baofengs. Yes, you know I saved this one for last, and for good reason. Now, I'm not against Baofeng itself. I think that for the price, they serve a very valid purpose, which is to bring cheap ham radio to the masses. But in the past, they've let me down greatly. Not just with the spurious emissions, which we all know is a problem, but the general user unfriendliness of the radios turns a lot of people off. You essentially have to use a computer to program them, and while you can use a keypad, it is not straightforward to do so. With that said, there is a new model called the GT5R, which is compliant with FCC rules and good with spurious emissions. So if you're looking for a Baofeng, that's your radio. The reality is, though, that there are other radios which offer ease of use for not much more money. I keep a couple of Baofengs to lend out, but they're not my first choice of radio. Also, go back to my experience with handheld radios, and you can see why they're frustrating to use sometimes. Unless you have strong local repeaters, I would look elsewhere. So that's what not to buy. But what should you buy? Without giving a specific recommendation for brand and model, this is what you should look for. In VHF, UHF, FM, I would look for a good mobile radio and a 12-volt power supply and install that at home. Unless I really needed a handheld radio, the 2-meter mobile at home being used as a fixed station radio is the way to go. Get one with 50 watts, dual band, 2-meter and 70 centimeter with a good antenna, and will offer you good coverage for both repeater and simplex use. For HF, get a 100-watt modern radio. Try to buy a new one with a warranty. Several manufacturers offer radios below or around $1,000 that are a great value for a newcomer. If you're looking at a used radio, ask a local ham to help you check out the radio, or get a guarantee that you can return a defective radio to the seller. Try to get something that has either a USB port or has the ability to plug in a sound card interface like the Signal Link. This way you can operate digital modes like PSK31, Olivia, and FT8. For mobile, there are a few radios, but you really should get one with a detachable control head so you can put the radio itself under the seat or in the trunk. These are great to save space in the front passenger compartment of the car and shorten the cables to antennas mounted at the rear of the vehicle. And as I said for all radios, concentrate on your antenna first. I cannot stress this enough. It will pay dividends in what you can do with your station. All right, I hope this was helpful. Leave your comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Until next time, this is N2RJ. Keep on hamming. See ya.